Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to take a nice, slow, deliberate walk through a truly fascinating piece of literature. We are unpacking Vikram Seth's famous poem, The Tale of Melon City. Now on the surface, it reads just like a simple children's fable, but as we look a bit closer, we uncover this brilliantly absurd, deadpan satire on administration, justice, and how our societies are actually practically governed. Just think about this for a second, will you? What actually happens when a leader's absolute obsession with an unwavering, perfectly rigid sense of justice ultimately leads to his very own execution? It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? We usually assume that rules and regulations are there to protect us, but here we're going to see how a leader's own bureaucratic rigidity literally, meticulously seals his own fate. So Vikram Seth opens his tale with these lines: "In the city of which I sing, there was a just and placid king." Now, those two words, just and placid, they're absolutely crucial here. Just meaning fair and equitable. Placid meaning calm, totally unbothered. I want you to keep these exact traits in your mind, because as this story unfolds, we are going to see how these supposedly noble, wonderful qualities become deeply, tragically ironic. Every massive disaster usually starts with a minor oversight, right? The king proclaims that a grand triumphal arch should be constructed spanning the main road. But when he proudly rides under it, a frown appears on his placid face. The arch was built just a bit too low, and it knocks the crown right off his head. A minor, almost comical incident. Yet, this tiny error derails the whole system. It's exactly like a massive corporate project completely going off the rails just because of a single typo in a memo. Now, what happens next is an absolute masterclass in passing the buck. The king immediately declares it a total disgrace and orders the chief of builders to be hanged. But the chief shouts, "O king, it was the workmen's fault." The workmen, in turn, say the bricks were the wrong size, so the masons are summoned, quivering with fear. And the masons, well, they blame the architect. It is a rapid-fire chain of deflection, perfectly mirroring that classic real-life bureaucratic blame game where absolutely no one wants to take accountability. And here is exactly where the blame game goes right back up to the top. The architect is brought in, facing the gallows, but he plays the ultimate trump card. He says, "O king, you have forgotten one small thing. You made certain amendments to the plans when I showed them to you." Boom. The architect elegantly deflects the blame right back to the top of the organizational chart. The leader demanding accountability is actually the very one who introduced the fatal flaw. The king heard this. The king saw red. In fact, he nearly lost his head. The deadpan seriousness of these lines is just brilliant. I mean, what happened to our just and placid king? The very moment he is faced with his own direct role in the failure, that calm demeanor completely shatters. It is a very tricky thing indeed when the ruler himself gets caught in his own strict web of laws. So, desperate for a solution that doesn't involve putting his own neck in the noose, the king demands counsel from the quote-unquote wisest man in this country. And how exactly does the state measure wisdom? Well, he was extremely old. He could not walk, and he could not see. He was so old, and therefore naturally assumed to be wise, that he literally had to be carried into court. It's such a sharp, satirical jab at systems that blindly equate extreme physical frailty and mere seniority with actual, real-world insight. This wisest man speaks in a quavering voice and delivers his final verdict. The culprit must be punished. And who is the culprit? Truly, the arch it was that banged the crown off, and it must be hanged. Just let the sheer absurdity of that sink in for a second. Driven by a desperate bureaucratic need to execute someone, the most celebrated mind in the entire nation decides the only logical solution is to literally lead an inanimate object to the scaffold.
But wait, the bureaucracy has even more red tape. Just as the arch is being led to the scaffold, a counselor raises a vital objection. "How can we hang so shamefully what touched your head, your majesty?" So absurd technicalities and this misplaced reverence end up saving the inanimate arch. But this creates a massive, massive problem. The crowd, you see, is assembled for a public execution, and they are restless. They are hungry for a scapegoat, and they flat out refuse to leave empty-handed. The text explicitly tells us that the king perceived their mood and trembled. Stepping up to face the muttering mob, we see this really stark portrayal of leadership under intense pressure. The king is no longer guiding his people. He is absolutely terrified of them. The desperate need for public appeasement has completely, entirely overridden any logical administration of justice. So the king makes a desperate pivot. He tells the crowd, let us postpone consideration of finer points like guilt. The nation wants a hanging. Hanged must be someone, and that immediately. There is a very direct parallel here to our modern situations, isn't there? Just think of severe corporate PR disasters, where the optics dictate that someone simply must take the fall, regardless of the actual facts. The system literally demands a sacrifice just to maintain the illusion of order. So the noose is set up, but in yet another stroke of sheer incompetence, it is set just a bit too high. The solution? Measure every man in the city until they find one who fits. Each man is measured, one by one, but only one man is tall enough to fit perfectly. One man, the king himself. By his own rigid insistence on immediate, by-the-book procedure, His Majesty is hanged. A slow, methodical, and profoundly poetic justice. The immediate aftermath is perhaps the most chillingly efficient part of the entire tale. The ministers simply sigh in relief. They say, thank goodness, we found someone, for if instead we had not, the unruly town might well have turned against the crown. And in the very same breath, they declare, long live the king. The king is dead. They pivot from executing their own leader to replacing him without a single second of actual mourning. It's just business as usual.
So how exactly does the state handle succession? Being practical-minded bureaucrats, the ministers don't hold an election or anything. They rely entirely on custom. The process is exactly 3 steps. 1. Wait at the city gate. 2. Ask the very next passerby to decide who is king. 3. Crown whoever they choose. It hilariously highlights a deeply flawed, arbitrary process, poking fun at institutions that follow custom blindly, completely devoid of any merit or logic.
And now we reach the ultimate punchline. A man passes by the city gate. The guards cry out, wait, who is to be king? Decide. Now this man happens to be an idiot. When asked who should rule the state, he replies, a melon. Why? Because it is a standard answer to absolutely all questions. He simply likes melons. The fate of the entire nation is decided by a man who just really, really likes fruit. Now, do the ministers question this? Of course not. You are now our king, they say, crowning a melon. Top government bureaucrats, heralds, and guards formally, physically carry a large melon to the royal throne and reverently, yes, reverently, set it down. They treat a literal piece of fruit as their absolute monarch simply because the process dictated it. You really couldn't make this up. Years and years pass. When the citizens are asked why their king appears to be a melon, they reply that as long as His Majesty rejoices in being a melon, well, that is fine with them, provided he leaves them in peace and liberty. The poem ends by noting that the principles of laissez-faire, meaning leaving things to take their own course, are well established there. The citizens are perfectly content with a rotting fruit for a leader because an inner leader cannot interfere with their lives. A melon, it turns out, is actually much less dangerous than a just and placid king. Vikram Seth's original prompt for this poem asks, does he carry his notion of justice a bit too far? I'm going to leave that for you to ponder. But beyond that, I want to challenge you. Look at the structures around you today. Look at the bureaucratic rules we follow simply because it is custom. Where are the systems prioritizing appeasement over logic? And most importantly, who or what are the melons sitting on the thrones in your own life? Let that sink in for a bit. Thank you so much for exploring this brilliant satire with me today.